What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Something very strange is happening around Belarus right now, because for years Alexander Lukashenko acted like Vladimir Putin's most reliable assistant, giving Russia territory, airspace, and all the usual theater of brotherhood and shared destiny. But now, when Ukraine is warning Belarus directly, when France's Emmanuel Macron is calling Lukashenko for the first recorded time ever since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion, and when Kiev says it already has 500 potential targets inside Belarus, Lukashenko is suddenly not running towards Putin. He's stepping back and saying, no, Belarusian troops are not going into Ukraine. This is the Belarusian problem finally catching up with him after more than 4 years of trying to sit on every chair at once. Minsk helped Moscow in 2022. Belarusian territory was used as a staging ground. Belarus has hosted Russian forces, supported trading, and stayed tied to Russian missiles, drones, joint nuclear exercises, and now even the Oreshnik missile conversation. But Lukashenko understands that if he crosses the final line, Belarus stops being just Putin's convenient backyard and becomes a direct target for consequences. So the thesis for today is quite simple. Belarus is not preparing to become the next giant front in a way that Russian propaganda sometimes suggests. The military math simply does not support that scenario. The political cost for Lukashenko is enormous, and Ukraine now has enough long-range capability to make Belarusian territory vulnerable in a way that it was not in February 2022. What we are seeing instead is a pressure campaign, where Kiev and Europe are warning Minsk, and Lukashenko is trying to stay useful to Putin without turning Belarus into the next battlefield. Can he do it though? That is the question. Here is the most surprising part. The strongest warning to Belarus did not come from a president or a foreign minister. It came from Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces commander Robert Brody, also known by the call sign Magyar, who said Ukraine had already identified the first 500 potential targets in Belarus if Minsk becomes more deeply involved in Russia's war. That number matters because it turns Belarus from an abstract threat into a concrete target list. For years, Lukashenko could behave as if the risk was just some kind of theoretical. Belarus could host Russian troops, let Russian assets move around, participate in exercises, and act as the conversation convenient porch from which Moscow threatens Kiev and Europe. But when Ukraine says that the first 500 targets are already identified, the conversation changes from Belarus is helping Russia to Belarusian infrastructure may become part of the cost calculation. And this is exactly why Lukashenko is so nervous, because he has watched what Ukrainian drones have done to Russia's rear areas, especially energy and logistics infrastructure. Brody also pointed to Ukrainian drone operations against Russian oil refineries, saying that 9 out of 13 Russian oil refineries had stopped operating after strikes by Ukrainian drones and forces led by his command alone. That is the kind of sentence Belarusian officials definitely read twice, and then pretend they did not read it at all. To be clear, Ukraine is not saying we want a bigger war with Belarus tomorrow morning. The point of deterrence is to stop the other side from making the next mistake. But the message is still extremely direct. If Belarus allows itself to become a deeper launchpad for Moscow, then Minsk should not expect immunity just because Lukashenko keeps pretending that he is not technically participating. And that takes us directly to the next part, because Kiev did not only send this message through a commander. The Belarus issue also moved back into the European diplomatic table, and that is where Emmanuel Macron enters the story. By the way, speaking about Magyar's threat and Lukashenko's response, have you ever noticed how exactly the same statement can sound either reassuring or terrifying, depending on the single headline you read? Just take a look here. One headline says, Lukashenko says Belarus has identified a major target in Ukraine, but has no plans for military action. That sounds relatively calm, diplomatic even. The emphasis is on the second half of the sentence, which is no plans for military action. The takeaway is that Belarus is only monitoring the situation, but nobody should just panic. But when you look at another headline covering the very same statement, which is war in Ukraine, Belarus threatens to attack Kiev. Well, guess what? Now the tone changes completely. Suddenly the story is not about restraint, it's about now threat. about escalation, about the possibility of a new front opening in the conflict. Same politician, same statement, same news even, to completely different emotional reactions. This is exactly why I personally use ground news. Instead of seeing just one headline chosen by an algorithm, ground news lets you compare headlines side by side from publications across the political spectrum. You can instantly see how different outlets frame the very same event and which parts of the story they are choosing to emphasize. In this case, one group of outlets highlights no plans for military action. Another focuses almost entirely on Belarus threatens to attack Kiev. Those choices matter a lot because most people never read just beyond the headlines. They see the headline and that's pretty much it. Ground news also shows you how many sources are covering a story and where those outlets fall politically, left, right, center, giving you the context needed to understand not just the news itself, but how the media landscape is presenting it. Because in today's world, understanding the story often means understanding the framing. Ground news also shows you summaries of left, center, and right-wing media, and its AI presents you with a bias comparison tool available with just a single click. So guys, if you want a special deal from Ground News that I was able to get just for you, specifically 40% off their Vantage plan, please go ahead and scan this QR code or go to ground.news/Russian Dude and please subscribe. Don't just read one headline, make a decision, no, instead see the entire picture and decide for yourself how you want to interpret world events. Thanks so much Ground News for sponsoring this video. Now back to the program. Now here's where things get tricky, because when Emmanuel Macron calls Alexander Lukashenko, it is not just a phone call. It is a signal that Europe sees Belarus not as a frozen side issue, but as a live security problem that could still create a new crisis on Ukraine's northern border. According to the Kyiv Independent, Macron warned Lukashenko on May 24th not to escalate Belarus's involvement in Russia's war. And yes, it happened more than a month ago, but what makes this call important is that it was the first recorded direct contact between Macron and Lukashenko since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, with Belarusian state media saying that the call had been initiated by the French side. That detail, which kind of seems small, but it actually matters, because Macron does not call Lukashenko because they're just some kind of old friends catching up about the weather in Minsk. No, Macron calls because the situation around Belarus has become serious enough that a direct warning is more useful than pretending that Lukashenko is still irrelevant. The timing also matters, because Macron's call came less than a week after Vladimir Zelensky warned that Russia might be preparing a new offensive against northern Ukraine with Belarusian help. Around the same period, Minsk announced joint nuclear-related drills with Moscow, and the fear of escalation was also connected to Russia's intermediate-range Oreshnik ballistic missile system and its deployment to Belarus. So, as you can see, Belarus is not just being discussed as a border country anymore, no. Now, it is being discussed as territory connected to Russia's long-range intimidation campaign against Ukraine and Europe. But there is another important detail. Andriy Demchenko, spokesperson for Ukraine's border guard service, said that Ukraine did not currently witness a buildup of equipment, weapons, or personnel right near the Belarusian border, even though he warned about increased Russian pressure on Belarus to join the war. That is the balancing act of the whole entire story. No visible giant buildup at the moment, but plenty of political smoke, Russian pressure, and Ukrainian warnings. So this is not a story where Belarus is definitely crossing the border tomorrow, even though, who knows. It is a story where everyone is trying to shape Lukashenko's decision before he makes one. And that brings us to Lukashenko's own response, because after all these warnings, he walked into Grodno and basically tried to say two opposite things all at once. This is what changed everything. Lukashenko publicly rejected direct Belarusian involvement in Ukraine, but he did it in a way that still left enough room to reassure Putin, which is exactly the kind of balancing act you perform when you are afraid of two different consequences at the same time. According to Kyiv Post, during a speech in Grodno on June 6th, Lukashenko declared that Belarusian troops would not take part in direct combat operations in Ukraine. He specifically asked whether Belarusians should go fight in Ukraine according to somebody else's will, saying that they did not want to become disposable manpower for another country's agenda. Well, to say the least that this is a revealing statement, it's say nothing. Because he's not talking like a man eager for glory. He is talking like a man who understands that Belarusian society is not sitting around begging to be sent into Putin's unfinished project. And honestly, why would they? Belarus has already paid a price for being tied to Russia's war without even being officially inside its full sense. The country has been sanctioned, associated with Moscow's decisions, and turned into a symbol of how one authoritarian leader can reduce a whole country to a support platform for another authoritarian leader's only ambitions. But then Lukashenko immediately did the second part of the dance. After rejecting direct deployment, he reassured Moscow that Minsk's military and defense cooperation with Russia remained unchanged, and that Belarus would continue to be an ally prepared to defend Russia, somehow, for whatever it means, if necessary. That is the whole Lukashenko problem in just one single sentence. We are not going with you, but please do not think we are leaving you. He then also addressed Poles, Lithuanians and Ukrainians, saying Belarus does not want to fight them. That is another telling line, because he is speaking not only to Moscow, but also to the neighbors, who would immediately understand what a Belarusian escalation could mean for the entire region. And the reason this matters is that Belarus has a roughly 1,000-kilometer northern frontier with Ukraine. And back in February 2022, Belarusian territory functioned as one of the main staging areas for Russia's move towards Kiev. So nobody in Ukraine is going to look at Belarus and just say, relax, it's probably something harmless. But Lukashenko knows something else too. If he directly sends Belarusian troops into Ukraine, he's not just helping Putin. He is risking his own regime's stability, because Belarusian soldiers are not Russian contract troops. Belarusian society is not prepared for that kind of national shock, and his propaganda system has spent years framing Belarus as protected, stable, and separate from the worst consequences of Russia's, Putin's decisions. That is why his message feels so nervous. He wants the Kremlin to hear loyalty, Ukraine and Europe to hear restraint, and his own people to hear that they will not be dragged into somebody else's nightmare. But here's the catch. Even as Lukashenko is trying to distance Belarus from direct involvement, Belarus is simultaneously becoming more integrated with Russia's control systems. And one of the clearest signs of that is what happened to Russian conscripts trying to use Belarus as an escape route. Now here's the most important part of today's video. While Lukashenko is trying to avoid sending Belarusians into Ukraine, Belarus is still cooperating with Russia in ways that make ordinary Russian people more trapped inside Putin's system. Novaya Gazeta Europe reported that Belarus would no longer allow Russians subject to a military draft notice to enter the country, citing Belarus's State Border Committee. The report described a Russian man being stopped from boarding flights in Minsk after receiving a conscription notice, after previously being stopped while attempting to leave Russia through the land border to Belarus. The Moscow Times reported the very same basic development. Russians who had received a conscription notice would no longer be allowed to travel through Belarus to avoid service. They literally closed the border. A spokesperson for Belarus State Border Committee said that if there were no travel restrictions, people could leave Belarus, but if travel was prohibited, questions should be directed to the Russian Federation. That sounds bureaucratic, but it is brutal in simplicity, because Belarus used to be a practical loophole for some Russians trying to leave. Formal border controls between Russia and Belarus have been largely abolished since 1995 under the Union State Treaty, and that helped make Belarus a route for people trying to avoid Russia's draft restrictions. Well, now that door is being narrowed, if not closed completely. The Moscow Times reported that Russia and Belarus share a common database even, that lets Belarusian border personnel see whether Russian citizens are restricted from leaving Russia. Imagine this. Novaya Gazeta Europe noted that experts questioned whether Belarus truly had access to Russia's full digital conscription database, because that system reportedly did not fully even function even inside Russia itself, but, well, at least the message is that it is quite possible. So this may be less about perfect technology and more about Russian and Belarusian border officials synchronizing enforcement under the Union State framework. And here is why this belongs in the Belarus briefing. Lukashenko is trying to avoid the big war step, but he is still letting Belarus become part of Russia's manpower control architecture. So when people say Belarus is distancing itself from Putin, the answer is yes, but only in a very specific way. Lukashenko does not want Belarusian troops directly involved, because that could create a massive domestic and military risk for him. But he is still cooperating with Moscow on draft enforcement, border restrictions, military exercise, and strategic messaging, because he cannot fully detach himself from the Russian system that helped keep him politically alive after 2020. That is the trap. He wants the benefits of being Putin's ally without the worst consequences of Putin's war. But by 2026, that bargain is getting very hard to maintain, because every small act of cooperation makes Belarus more responsible in the eyes of Ukraine and Europe, while every act of distancing makes Moscow wonder whether Lukashenko is still useful enough. And this is where the military reality becomes essential, because the question is not just whether Lukashenko wants to join the war, but whether Belarus and Russia could realistically create a serious northern offensive again without everyone seeing it coming. Let's look at this from a different angle, because propaganda loves drama, but military planning still has to deal with troop numbers, training, and whether an army can actually move without being detected. Carnegie analyst Artem Schreibman wrote on June 2nd that senior Ukrainian officials had warned Belarus might be preparing to enter the war, while military experts and monitoring groups said there was no indications of Belarus preparing for a repeated invasion of Ukraine, even though the number of warning signs had become too large to ignore completely. That is the key line. No clear evidence of a repeat invasion, but enough warning signs that Ukraine cannot just shrug away and move on. Carnegie also noted that about 2,000 Russian troops are permanently stationed in Belarus, but any serious new invasion from Belarus would require Russia to move tens of thousands of troops and military hardware there. That would be obviously difficult to hide, and it would also raise the question of where Moscow would even find those reserves without weakening other parts of the front lines. That is why the Belarus will suddenly enter the war narrative is more complicated than it sounds. A real northern operation is not just Lukashenko giving a speech and a few trucks appearing near the border. It would require a visible build-up, extended preparation, supply lines, command coordination, and reserves that Russia may not want to pull away from Donbass or other active directions. And unlike February 2022, there would be no surprise. Ukraine has fortified and mined the border, long-range drones have transformed the battlefield, and Carnegie's analysis points out that another infantry and tank push towards Kiev would make very little sense because it did not work the first time. The border is now simply prepared, way more prepared, and drones would slow that kind of movement dramatically. This is why Lukashenko's threats sound weaker today than they did years ago. In 2022, Russia was still trying to project unstoppable momentum, but in 2026, every additional escalation has to be measured against a battlefield where drones are everywhere, logistics are exposed, rear areas are vulnerable, and the side that opens a new direction may also open a new list of targets. And Belarus is much closer to Ukraine than even many Russian rear areas, which is exactly why Carnegie warned that if Minsk increases involvement, it would untie Kiev's hands and make Belarusian territory a very convenient target for Ukrainian drones, including military infrastructure, defense enterprises used by Russia, and energy infrastructure, such as two major oil refineries that have become important fuel reserves for the European part of Russia when Russia's own refineries are offline. So the military math points to a single one direction. A giant Belarusian front is not impossible in theory, but it is very unlikely without visible preparation, major Russian sources, and a willingness by Lukashenko himself to accept the risks that could threaten his own regime more than they can help Putin. And that leads us to the bigger strategic question. Why is Ukraine talking so loudly about Belarus right now if a major invasion is not even clearly imminent? Here's the part that most people skip. Ukraine's warnings about Belarus are not only about preventing a military operation, they are also about preventing diplomatic normalization of Lukashenko while the war is still going on. Carnegie argues that Ukraine's tougher line on Belarus has grown over the last 6 months, including new sanctions packages against Lukashenko and his associates. Zelensky meeting Belarusian opposition leader Svetlana Tsikhanovskaya in Vilnius and later even receiving her in Kiev. That detail once again matters here because Tsikhanovskaya represents the alternative Belarus that Lukashenko is terrified of, which is a Belarus not chained to Putin, not used as Moscow's launchpad, and not treated as a satellite state that exists mostly to amplify Kremlin pressure. Euronews also reported that Zelensky met Tsikhanovskaya in Kiev shortly after Lukashenko had suggested a meeting with Zelensky. That is not an accident. That is a message. Lukashenko says, "Let's talk," while Zelensky meets the opposition leader. And the message is also clear. Ukraine does not see Lukashenko as the same thing as Belarus, and Ukraine is not going to reward him for helping Russia in 2022 just because he now wants to look like more reasonable middleman. Carnegie also points to another layer. Ukraine may be worried about the developing dialogue between Minsk and Washington, including US sanctions easing and pressure connected to Belarusian potash exports through neighboring ports. From Kyiv's perspective, making concessions to Lukashenko after Belarus allowed Russian troops to use its territory in 2022 looks deeply unjust while the war is still ongoing. And this is where Ukraine's strategy becomes clear. Remind everyone that Lukashenko is not neutral. Remind Europe and Washington that Belarus is still a security problem, and then remind Minsk that every step deeper into Putin's war creates practical consequences for them. Ukraine has discovered that Belarus can be deterred and pressured because Lukashenko is not Putin. He does not have Russia's resources, territory, or Russia's ability to absorb damage while pretending everything is fine. And that is why this story matters far beyond Belarus. Now here's the real reason everything we discussed today matters. Belarus is a window into Putin's wider alliance problem, because the longer this war continues, the more Russia's supposed partners start behaving less like loyal friends and more like nervous business partners trying to reduce exposure. China, for example, cooperates with Russia when it benefits China, but Beijing is not sacrificing its global economic position just to make Putin feel respected. India then buys Russian energy when the price is rightful and when the price is right and useful, but it also keeps relationships with the West and refuses to become a full-time Russian satellite. Even North Korea may provide Moscow with support and political theater, but that relationship is transactional too. And it does not magically solve Russia's economic, demographic, or battlefield problems. And then there is Belarus, the closest ally, the country most physically tied to Russia's military geography, the state that already gave Moscow access in 2022, and the regime that owes so much of its post-2020 survival to Putin's backing. If even that ally is now openly saying Belarusian troops will not enter Ukraine and Russian men are prohibited from hiding in the country from Putin's mobilization, then the story becomes much bigger than just one single speech in Grodno. It means Putin's war is no longer something allies want to join. It is something allies want to manage, contain, profit from where possible, and distance themselves from when the price gets a little bit too high. That is exactly what Lukashenko is doing. He is not breaking up with Putin. He is not joining Europe. He is not suddenly becoming independent in the heroic sense. But he is trying to avoid becoming the next man who pays for Putin's decisions with his own internal stability. Lukashenko was probably promised, like many others, that Russia's war would be quick, decisive and profitable. He was probably told that Ukraine would collapse, the West would complain for a few weeks, sanctions would be survivable, and Belarus would be on the winning side of the history. But 4.5 years later, where is that glorious victory? Russia is still stuck in a long war with no end, Belarus is sanctioned and isolated, the country is threatened as an accomplice, not as a neutral neighbor. And now Ukraine is even openly warning that Belarusian targets are already mapped if Minsk crossed the line. So of course Lukashenko is stepping away. not because he became wise suddenly, not because he suddenly cares about Ukraine, but because he understands that Putin's war is turning from an opportunity into a liability. Guys, if today's episode was insightful, please feel free to subscribe to our channel, like this video. Thanks so much Ground News for sponsoring this video. All useful links are down below. Thanks so much for watching. See you on Monday.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims are all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.